The autumn wind cut through Sarah McKenna's threadbare dress like a blade, carrying with it the promise of the first hard frost that would surely come before morning. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and looked up through the bare branches of the oak tree that had become her reluctant shelter. The sky was the color of old pewter, heavy with clouds that threatened either rain or snow, neither of which she could survive in her current state. At 24, Sarah had once been the picture of frontier respectability, the wife of merchant David McKenna, mistress of a comfortable home in the growing town of Millfield, a woman with a secure future and social standing that life felt like a dream. Now, something that had happened to someone else in a story she had heard long ago. The reality was this: 3 days without food, a week without proper shelter, and the growing certainty that she would not survive another night sleeping rough in the wilderness. The chain of disasters that had brought her to this desperate point still felt surreal. David's sudden death from a heart attack at 32 had been shocking enough, but it was what came after that had truly destroyed her. His business partner, James Whitmore, had produced documents showing that David had borrowed heavily against their home and shop to cover gambling debts Sarah had never known existed. Within 2 weeks of the funeral, she had lost everything: the house, the store, even most of her personal belongings, which Whitmore claimed as collateral. Sarah had tried to find work in Millfield, but Whitmore's influence ran deep. Potential employers were told she was unreliable, possibly dishonest, certainly not the kind of woman they wanted associated with their establishments. The few friends she thought she could count on had distanced themselves, unwilling to risk their own social standing by helping a woman who had fallen so far so fast. With no money for lodging and nowhere to turn, Sarah had been forced to leave town entirely. For the past week, she had been walking west, hoping to reach her sister's homestead near Denver, living on wild berries and stream water, sleeping wherever she could find minimal shelter. But Colorado was still hundreds of miles away. Winter was coming fast, and her strength was nearly gone. Sarah gathered another armload of fallen leaves, trying to create a barrier against the wind that swept across the small clearing where she had stopped for the night. Her hands were raw and cracked, her feet blistered and bleeding through the holes in her worn boots. She had long since stopped caring about her appearance. Her dark hair hung in tangles, her dress was stained and torn, and she knew she must look like exactly what she had become: a vagrant, a woman without home or hope. As darkness fell, Sarah burrowed deeper into her makeshift bed of leaves and tried to ignore the gnawing hunger in her belly. She had eaten the last of the rose hips she had found 2 days ago, and her searches today had yielded nothing edible. Tomorrow she would have to try again. Assuming she had the strength to get up and keep walking, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her freeze with terror. In her current vulnerable state, any encounter with strangers posed potential danger. Sarah pressed herself deeper into the leaves, hoping the rider would pass by without noticing her poor camp. But the hoofbeats slowed, then stopped, and she heard a man's voice calling out, "Hello there, are you all right? Do you need help?" Sarah's first instinct was to remain hidden, but something in the voice, a genuine concern rather than threat, made her hesitate. She peered through the branches and saw a tall man dismounting from a large bay horse about 20 yards away. He was dressed like a working rancher, with worn leather chaps and a hat that had seen better days, but his movements were careful and non-threatening. "I saw your camp from the ridge," the man continued, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I don't mean to intrude, but it's going to be a cold night, and this doesn't seem like a safe place for anyone to be sleeping rough against." Her better judgment, Sarah found herself responding. "I'm fine," she called out, though her voice was hoarse from thirst and exhaustion, "just resting for the night." The man took a few steps closer, and Sarah could see his face more clearly in the fading light. He appeared to be in his late 30s, with dark hair and a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. His expression was concerned but respectful, and he made no move to approach her hiding spot directly. "Mum, forgive me for being blunt, but you don't sound fine. And with all respect, sleeping in a pile of leaves when the temperature's about to drop below freezing isn't resting. It's dying slowly." Sarah felt tears sting her eyes at his matter-of-fact assessment of her situation. She had been trying so hard to maintain some dignity, some pretense that she was simply traveling and had chosen this uncomfortable accommodation. But the stranger's words forced her to confront the truth of her desperate circumstances. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "I'm traveling to Denver, but I don't have money for lodging or food." The man was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could sense him weighing his options. When he spoke again, his voice was firm but kind. "Mum, my name is Thomas Brennan, and I own a ranch about 5 miles from here. I've got a spare room, hot food, and a warm fire. I'd be honored if you'd accept my hospitality for the night, at least until this cold snap passes." Sarah's immediate reaction was suspicion. In her experience, men who offered help to desperate women usually expected something in return, something she was not prepared to give. "Mr. Brennan, I appreciate the offer, but I don't think that would be appropriate." "I understand your concerns," Thomas replied, his voice patient. "But ma'am, I'm not offering anything inappropriate. I'm offering basic human decency to someone who needs help. I've got a housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, who's been with me for years. You'd have your own room, complete privacy, and no obligations beyond accepting a warm meal and a safe place to sleep." Sarah found herself wavering. The thought of a real bed, hot food, and shelter from the wind was almost tempting to resist. But she had learned to be wary of offers that seemed too good to be true. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why would you help a complete stranger?" Thomas was quiet for another moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain. "Because 3 years ago, I was in a situation where I needed help desperately, and someone showed me kindness when they didn't have to. I swore then that if I ever had the chance to do the same for someone else, I would." Something in his tone convinced Sarah that he was telling the truth. More than that, she was beginning to realize that she truly didn't have any other options. She could accept his help and risk whatever dangers that might entail, or she could stay here and almost certainly die of exposure or starvation within the next few days. "I don't have anything to offer in return," Sarah said quietly. "No money, no way to repay your kindness." "I'm not asking for repayment," Thomas replied. "I'm asking you to let me help you because it's the right thing to do." Sarah slowly emerged from her nest of leaves, and she saw Thomas's eyes widen slightly as he took in her bedraggled appearance. She knew she must look terrible, dirty, thin, desperate, but to his credit, his expression showed only compassion, not judgment. "Ma'am," he said gently, "when did you last have a proper meal?" Sarah tried to remember, but the days of hunger had blurred together. 3 days, maybe 4. She admitted. "I found some berries yesterday." But before that, Thomas's jaw tightened. With anger, though Sarah sensed it wasn't directed at her. "Well, that settles it. You're coming with me right now, and we're going to get some food in you before you collapse." As Thomas helped her gather her few possessions, a small bundle of clothes and a locket that had been her mother's, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. She was trusting her safety to a complete stranger. But what choice did she have? At least if something bad happened, it would be warmer and quicker than freezing to death in a pile of leaves. Thomas boosted her up onto his horse, and Sarah marveled at how weak she had become. Tasks that would have been simple a week ago now required significant effort. As they rode through the darkness toward his ranch, Thomas kept up a gentle stream of conversation, telling her about the area, the weather, anything to distract her from her fears and discomfort. "You mentioned you're heading to Denver," he said as they crested a hill and Sarah could see lights in the distance. "Do you have family there?" "My sister," Sarah replied. "She married a homesteader out there 2 years ago. I'm hoping she can help me start over." "I'm sure she will," Thomas said kindly. "Family looks out for family, but you'll need to regain your strength before you attempt that journey. Denver's still a long way off, and the mountain passes can be treacherous this time of year." As they approached the ranch house, a substantial log building with warm light glowing in the windows, Sarah felt her anxiety increase. What if this man wasn't as kind as he seemed? What if his housekeeper didn't exist? What if she was walking into a situation that would be worse than sleeping in the wilderness? But when Thomas helped her down from the horse and led her toward the front door, it opened to reveal a plump, middle-aged Mexican woman with concerned eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Dios mío," the woman exclaimed, taking in Sarah's condition. "Thomas, what have you found?" "Mrs. Rodriguez, this is..." Thomas paused and looked at Sarah apologetically. "I'm sorry. I don't believe I got your name." "Sarah," she said quietly. "Sarah McKenna. Mrs. Rodriguez, this is Sarah McKenna," Thomas continued. "She's been traveling in difficult circumstances and needs our help. Could you prepare the guest room and perhaps some soup?" Mrs. Rodriguez bustled forward and gently took Sarah's arm. Of course, you poor child. You're half frozen and starved. Come, we'll get you warm and fed immediately." As Mrs. Rodriguez led her into the house, Sarah looked back at Thomas, who was already heading toward the barn to tend to his horse. She wanted to thank him, to express her gratitude for his unexpected kindness, but she found herself too overwhelmed to speak. The interior of the house was warm and comfortable, with a large stone fireplace and furniture that spoke of modest prosperity. Mrs. Rodriguez guided Sarah to a chair near the fire and immediately began fussing over her, bringing blankets and hot tea, while she heated soup in the kitchen. "You just rest now," the older woman said kindly. "Tomorrow we'll worry about getting you some proper clothes and building up your strength. Tonight, you're safe and warm, and that's all that matters." As Sarah sat in the comfortable chair, sipping hot tea and feeling warmth seep back into her bones for the first time in days, she found herself wondering if she was dreaming. After a week of desperation and despair, she had stumbled into what seemed like a miracle. Two strangers who were treating her with more kindness than her own friends had shown in her time of need. When Thomas returned from the barn, he found Sarah dozing in the chair by the fire, the empty soup bowl in her lap, evidence of how hungry she had been. He carefully removed the bowl and adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, his touch gentle enough not to wake her. The poor thing was near death. Mrs. Rodriguez whispered from the kitchen doorway, "How could anyone let a young woman get into such a state?" "I don't know," Thomas replied quietly, his eyes fixed on Sarah's sleeping face. "But she's safe now, that's what matters." As Sarah slept by the fire, dreaming for the first time in weeks of warmth and safety, she had no way of knowing that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't imagine. She had found more than just shelter from the storm. She had found her way to a man who would show her what home really meant. Sarah woke to the smell of bacon frying and coffee brewing, sensations so familiar yet so distant that for a moment she couldn't remember where she was. Sunlight was streaming through clean windows, and she was lying in an actual bed with real sheets and a warm quilt. The contrast to her week of sleeping rough was so stark that she wondered if she might still be dreaming. The guest room was simple but comfortable, with whitewashed walls, a sturdy wooden dresser, and a wash basin with fresh water. On the chair beside the bed, someone had laid out clean clothes, a simple brown dress that looked like it would fit her, along with undergarments and stockings that were clearly new. A soft knock on the door interrupted her wondering assessment of her surroundings. "Sarah," Mrs. Rodriguez's voice called gently. "Are you awake, Mija? I have breakfast ready when you're feeling up to it." Sarah sat up slowly, surprised by how weak she still felt, despite a full night's sleep. "I'm awake," she called back. "Thank you for the clothes. I'll be down in a few minutes." "Take your time," Mrs. Rodriguez replied. "The food will wait." Sarah rose carefully and moved to the wash basin, gasping slightly when she caught sight of herself in the small mirror above it. The woman looking back at her was almost unrecognizable, hollow-cheeked, with dark circles under her eyes and skin that had been weathered by days of exposure. Her hair hung in matted tangles, and she could see that she had lost significant weight during her ordeal. The warm water felt like luxury as she washed away days of dirt and exhaustion. As she dressed in the clean clothes, Sarah marveled at how much better she felt simply from being warm and clean. The dress fit reasonably well, though it hung loose in places where she had lost weight. When she made her way downstairs, she found Thomas sitting at a large wooden table reading a newspaper, while Mrs. Rodriguez bustled around the kitchen. The domestic scene was so normal, so peaceful, that Sarah felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "Good morning," Thomas said, looking up with a gentle smile. "You look much better." Did you sleep well? Better than I have in weeks, Sarah admitted, accepting the chair he pulled out for her. I can't thank you both enough for your kindness. Mrs. Rodriguez set a plate in front of her loaded with eggs, bacon, biscuits, and fried potatoes, more food than Sarah had seen in days. Eat, the older woman commanded kindly. You need to rebuild your strength, as Sarah ate. Trying not to appear too desperate despite her hunger, Thomas explained the routine of the ranch. He raised cattle and horses, with the help of 3 hired hands who lived in the bunkhouse. Mrs. Rodriguez managed the household and had been with him since he'd bought the property 4 years earlier. The men are good people, Thomas said, noting Sarah's slight tension when he mentioned the other workers. They're respectful and keep to themselves mostly. You don't need to worry about any inappropriate behavior. Sarah nodded gratefully. Mr. Brennan, I need to ask, how long were you planning to let me stay? I don't want to impose on your hospitality longer than necessary. Thomas and Mrs. Rodriguez exchanged a look that Sarah couldn't interpret. Sarah, Thomas said carefully, you're welcome to stay as long as you need to. But I have to be honest, you're in no condition to travel anywhere right now. You need time to recover your strength, and frankly, winter travel through the mountains to Denver is dangerous even for someone in perfect health. The truth of his words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had been so focused on reaching her sister that she hadn't truly considered the practical difficulties. Even if she left today, she would likely freeze or starve before covering half the distance to Denver. I can work, Sarah said quickly, anxiety rising in her voice. I can't pay you in money, but I can help around the house, with cooking or cleaning or whatever you need. Mrs. Rodriguez made a dismissive sound. Child, you can barely stand up straight. We're not talking about you earning your keep, we're talking about you getting well. Thomas leaned forward slightly, his expression serious but kind. Sarah, I hope you won't take this the wrong way, but can you tell us what happened to you? How did you end up sleeping in the woods with nothing but the clothes on your back? Sarah hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, but these people had already shown her more kindness than she had any right to expect, and she owed them at least an explanation. Slowly, haltingly, she told them about David's death, about Whitmore's betrayal, about losing everything and being forced to leave Millfield with nowhere to go. As she spoke, she watched their faces for signs of judgment or disbelief, but found only compassion and growing anger at the injustices she had suffered. This Whitmore, Thomas said when she had finished, his voice tight with controlled fury. He just took everything, without giving you any chance to contest his claims. He had documents, Sarah said quietly, bills of sale, loan agreements, all with David's signature. I had no lawyer, no money to fight him, and no one in town willing to stand up to him. Mrs. Rodriguez muttered something in Spanish that sounded distinctly uncomplimentary toward Whitmore and his ancestry. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as he processed what Sarah had told them. Sarah, he said finally, I want you to understand something. What happened to you was wrong. Whatever debts your husband may have had, the way you were treated was unconscionable. No decent man would have thrown a widow out with nothing. Sarah felt tears starting again at the validation in his voice. For weeks, she had been wondering if somehow she deserved what had happened, if there was something she could have done differently. The question now, Thomas continued, is what you want to do going forward. You're welcome to stay here through the winter, and I mean that sincerely. Come spring, if you still want to go to Denver, I'll make sure you get there safely and with enough money to start over properly. The generosity of his offer overwhelmed Sarah completely. She put her face in her hands and began to sob, not just from gratitude, but from the relief of finally being safe, of having time to think and plan without the constant pressure of immediate survival. Mrs. Rodriguez moved around the table and put her arms around Sarah's shoulders, making soothing sounds while Thomas sat quietly, giving her space to process her emotions. I'm sorry, Sarah finally managed, wiping her eyes with the handkerchief Mrs. Rodriguez had pressed into her hands. I'm not usually so emotional, Mija, Mrs. Rodriguez said gently. You've been through more than anyone should have to endure. Tears are natural and healthy. Thomas nodded agreement. "Sarah, you don't need to make any decisions right now. Focus on getting your strength back, and we'll figure out the rest as we go." Over the following days, Sarah began to settle into the rhythm of ranch life, despite her protests. Thomas and Mrs. Rodriguez insisted that her only job was to recover her health. She spent her mornings sitting on the front porch in the sunshine, her afternoons reading books from Thomas's surprisingly extensive library, and her evenings by the fire, often listening to Mrs. Rodriguez's stories about her family in Mexico. Thomas was unfailingly kind and respectful, but Sarah noticed that he often seemed withdrawn, almost melancholy. She began to understand that he, too, was carrying some burden from his past. He worked hard, managed his ranch efficiently, and treated his employees well. But there was a loneliness about him that resonated with her own sense of displacement. It was during her second week at the ranch that Sarah finally gathered the courage to ask him about it. They were sitting on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. When she decided to breach the subject, "Thomas," she said carefully, "you mentioned that someone helped you when you needed it. What happened to you?" Thomas was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with old pain. "I was married once," he said quietly. "Her name was Elizabeth. She was everything good in the world. Beautiful, kind, intelligent. We had 2 years together. The happiest 2 years of my life." Sarah waited, sensing there was more to the story. "She died in childbirth," Thomas continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "The baby too, a son. I lost my mind for a while after that. Started drinking, neglecting the ranch, pushing away everyone who tried to help. I probably would have lost everything if it hadn't been for my neighbor, an old rancher named Jim Patterson. What did he do? He saved my life," Thomas said simply. "Literally, he found me passed out drunk in a snowstorm, brought me to his house, and refused to let me leave until I sobered up and started thinking clearly again. Then he helped me rebuild what I'd nearly destroyed through my grief and self-pity." Sarah felt her heart clench with sympathy for his loss. "I'm so sorry, Thomas. I can't imagine how difficult that must have been. Jim used to say that grief was like a deep well. You could fall into it and drown, or you could learn to draw strength from it. He taught me that the best way to honor Elizabeth's memory was to live the kind of life she would have wanted me to live." Sarah understood now why Thomas had been so quick to help her, why he seemed to recognize the particular kind of desperation that came from losing everything that mattered. "Is that why you helped me? Because of what Jim Patterson did for you?" Thomas turned to look at her directly, and Sarah was struck by the intensity in his dark eyes. "Partly," he said, "but also because helping you has given me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. Having you here has made this house feel like a home again, instead of just a place where I sleep." The admission hung in the air between them, charged with implications that both of them were afraid to explore. Sarah felt her cheeks warm, but she didn't look away from his gaze. "Thomas," she said softly, "I need you to know that your kindness has saved my life, not just from freezing or starving, but from despair. You've given me hope when I thought I had none left. You've given me something to, Sarah." Thomas replied, "You've reminded me that life can still surprise you, that there's still goodness in the world, worth protecting." As they sat together in the gathering darkness, Sarah felt something shifting between them, an awareness that their relationship was evolving beyond simple charity into something deeper and more complex. She was grateful for his help, but she was also beginning to see him as a man rather than just a benefactor. And from the way he looked at her, she suspected he was having similar thoughts. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. She was still legally a widow, still mourning the loss of her previous life, still uncertain about her future, but she was also a woman who had been shown extraordinary kindness by an extraordinary man, and she found herself wondering if perhaps her journey west had brought her exactly where she was meant to be. That night, as Sarah lay in her comfortable bed listening to the wind whistle around the house, she thought about the strange turns her life had taken. A month ago, she had been Mrs. David McKenna, a respectable merchant's wife with a secure future. 2 weeks ago, she had been a desperate vagrant sleeping in a pile of leaves. certain she was going to die alone and forgotten. Now she was Sarah, a woman being offered a chance to rebuild her life in the home of a man who was beginning to mean far more to her than simple gratitude could explain. For the first time since David's death, she found herself looking forward to tomorrow instead of simply dreading it. Whatever the future held, she was no longer facing it alone, and that, she realized, made all the difference in the world. The first snow of winter arrived in late November, blanketing the ranch in pristine white that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching Thomas and his men bring the cattle down from the high pastures to winter quarters closer to the barn. He moved with easy confidence in the saddle, directing the operation with quiet authority that spoke of years of experience. In the 6 weeks since her arrival, Sarah had regained much of her strength and weight. The hollow cheeks and haunted look had been replaced by a healthy glow, and her hair, now properly washed and cared for, fell in shining waves to her shoulders. More importantly, the constant fear and desperation that had driven her for so long had been replaced by something she had almost forgotten existed: contentment. "He's a good man," Mrs. Rodriguez said, appearing beside Sarah at the window with a knowing smile. "And he cares for you very much." Sarah felt her cheeks warm at the older woman's directness. Over the weeks, she had grown close to Mrs. Rodriguez, who had become something of a mother figure to her. The housekeeper had a way of seeing straight to the heart of things, and wasn't shy about expressing her opinions. "He's been very kind to me," Sarah replied carefully. Mrs. Rodriguez made a dismissive sound. "Kind, yes, but also in love. Any fool can see it in the way he looks at you, the way he finds excuses to spend time near you. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Sarah turned away from the window, unsure how to respond. She couldn't deny that her feelings for Thomas had evolved far beyond gratitude. He was intelligent, compassionate, and possessed a quiet strength that made her feel safe in ways she had never experienced before. But the situation was complicated by their circumstances and her own uncertainty about the future. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Sarah said carefully, "I can't take advantage of Thomas's kindness by presuming he feels anything more than compassion for someone he helped." The older woman laughed outright at that. "Child, you think I've lived 60 years without learning to recognize when a man is smitten? Thomas lights up when you enter a room. He asks my opinion about meals because he wants to make sure you're eating foods you enjoy. Yesterday I caught him reading the same page of his newspaper 3 times because he was too busy watching you mend his shirt to concentrate." Sarah felt a flutter of hope mixed with anxiety. Even if that's true, there are practical considerations. I have nothing to offer him. No money, no property, no social connections. I'm a widow with a ruined reputation who was sleeping in the woods when he found me. And he's a widower who was drinking himself to death in grief when his neighbor found him. Mrs. Rodriguez pointed out pragmatically, "We all have past troubles, Mija. The question is whether we let them define our future." Before Sarah could respond, the kitchen door opened and Thomas entered, stamping snow off his boots and bringing the smell of cold air and horses with him. His face was red from the wind, and his dark hair was dusted with snowflakes. "Ladies," he said with a smile that seemed to focus particularly on Sarah, "I hope you've got something warm brewing. It's getting brutal out there." Mrs. Rodriguez immediately busied herself with pouring coffee and heating soup, while Sarah moved to help Thomas out of his heavy coat. As she hung it by the fire to dry, she caught him watching her with an expression that made her pulse quicken. "How are the cattle?" she asked, partly to cover her nervousness and partly because she had grown genuinely interested in the ranch's operations. "Settled in for the winter," Thomas replied, accepting a steaming mug from Mrs. Rodriguez. "We got them down just in time. This storm is going to be a bad one," as if to emphasize his words. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending snow swirling across the yard. Sarah felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. The thought of being caught in such weather with no shelter was a reminder of how close she had come to disaster. Thomas must have noticed her reaction because he moved closer, his voice gentle. "Sarah, you're safe here. Whatever storms come, you're safe." The simple reassurance combined with the warmth in his eyes, nearly undid her completely. Sarah found herself blinking back tears, overwhelmed by the contrast between her current security and the desperation she had felt just weeks earlier. "I know," she whispered. Sometimes I can't believe this is real, that I'm not going to wake up back in those woods, cold and hungry and alone." Thomas set down his coffee mug and gently took her hands in his larger ones. "Sarah, look at me." She raised her eyes to meet his, seeing an intensity there that made her breath catch. "You are never going to be cold and hungry and alone again," he said firmly. "I give you my word on that. Whatever else happens, whatever you decide about your future, you'll always have a home here with me." Sarah felt tears spill over at the fierce protectiveness in his voice. "Thomas, you can't make promises like that. You don't know what the future holds." "I know what I want it to hold," he replied quietly. "Sarah, I need to tell you something, and I hope it won't make you uncomfortable or feel pressured in any way." Sarah's heart began to race, sensing that they were approaching a moment that would change everything between them. "I'm in love with you," Thomas said simply. "I think I have been since that first night when I found you trying to be brave, while facing down circumstances that would have broken most people. You're the strongest, most courageous woman I've ever known, and every day you're here makes my life better in ways I can't even properly express." Sarah stared at him, her mind reeling. Part of her had hoped to hear those words, but another part had convinced her it was impossible, that she was reading too much into his kindness. "Thomas," she began, but he gently squeezed her hands to stop her. "Let me finish," he said. "I know our situation is complicated. I know you've been through terrible trauma and loss, and the last thing I want is for you to feel obligated to return my feelings out of gratitude. If what you want is help getting to Denver to start a new life there, I'll provide that gladly. But if there's any chance that you might want to build a life here with me, then I'm asking you to consider it." Sarah felt as if her heart might burst from the combination of joy, relief, and love that flooded through her. "Thomas, do you really think gratitude is what I feel for you?" He searched her face uncertainly. "I hope not, but I know how confusing it can be when someone helps you in a desperate situation." "Thomas," Sarah interrupted, stepping closer to him, "I love you too. Not because you saved me, but because of who you are. Because you're kind without being weak, strong without being harsh, generous without expecting anything in return. Because you make me feel safe and valued and cherished in ways I never even knew were possible." The joy that transformed Thomas's face was like sunrise after a long night. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "Sarah, are you sure? Are you absolutely certain this is what you want?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she replied, rising on her toes to meet him halfway as he leaned down to kiss her. Their first kiss was gentle and tentative, a question asked and answered. But when Sarah responded by wrapping her arms around his neck and pressing closer, it deepened into something that spoke of love finally acknowledged and a future full of possibility. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sarah became aware that Mrs. Rodriguez had discreetly disappeared, leaving them alone in the kitchen with only the crackling fire and the sound of wind outside. "Sarah," Thomas whispered against her hair, "will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life showing you how precious you are to me?" Sarah pulled back to look into his eyes, seeing there everything she had ever dreamed of finding in a partner: love, respect, protection, and the promise of a true partnership built on mutual care and understanding. "Yes," she said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I'll marry you, Thomas Brennan. And yes, I want to build a life here with you, in this beautiful place that's already become more of a home to me than anywhere I've ever lived." The storm raged outside for 3 days, but inside the ranch house, Sarah and Thomas planned their future with the excitement of children planning a grand adventure. They talked about everything: when to hold the wedding, how to expand the house, what crops to plant in the spring, how many children they hoped to have. Mrs. Rodriguez was so delighted by the engagement that she cried happy tears for an hour, and immediately began planning a wedding feast that would, in her words, show the whole territory what true love looks like. When the storm finally cleared and the world emerged sparkling white under brilliant sunshine. Thomas and Sarah walked together through the snow-covered ranch, and Sarah marveled at how completely her life had changed. 3 months ago, she had been a different person living a different life. 2 months ago, she had been a desperate woman sleeping in a pile of leaves, certain she was going to die alone and forgotten. Now she was a woman in love, preparing to marry a man who saw her not as a charity case or a victim, but as a partner, worthy of his respect and devotion. She had found more than just shelter from the storm. She had found her home, her family, her future. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me that night?" Sarah asked as they stood together on a hill overlooking the valley. Thomas considered the question seriously. "I try not to think about it," he admitted. "The idea of you alone out there, facing winter with no help, it's too painful to contemplate." "I think I would have died," Sarah said matter-of-factly. "Not just from the cold or hunger, but from despair. I had given up hope, Thomas. I was just going through the motions of trying to survive because I didn't know what else to do." Thomas pulled her closer against his side. "But you didn't die. You're here, you're strong, and you're going to have a wonderful life. That's what matters now." Sarah leaned into his warmth, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had lost everything she thought defined her: her husband, her home, her social position, her security. But in losing all of that, she had found something infinitely more valuable, a love that was freely given and joyfully received, a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection. "Thomas," she said softly, "I need you to know something. When you found me that night and said I needed help, I thought you were just being kind to a stranger. But when you brought me here and said, 'You're home now,' that was the moment my real life began." Thomas turned to face her fully, his eyes bright with love and determination. "Then let's make sure it's the most beautiful life we can possibly create together." 6 months later, on a warm spring morning filled with the scent of wildflowers and new grass, Sarah Brennan stood in the same clearing where she had once huddled in a pile of leaves, certain she was going to die. Now she wore a simple but elegant white dress that Mrs. Rodriguez had sewn for her wedding, and her hand was firmly clasped in Thomas's as they exchanged vows. Before a small gathering of neighbors and friends, the transformation of the clearing was symbolic of the transformation in Sarah's life. Where once there had been only bare earth and dead leaves, now wildflowers bloomed in abundance. Where once she had faced the world alone and afraid, now she stood surrounded by people who had become her chosen family. "Do you, Thomas Brennan, take Sarah McKenna to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Thomas said firmly, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "And I promise to love and cherish her, to be her partner and protector, and to make sure she never doubts for a moment that she is home." "And do you, Sarah McKenna, take Thomas Brennan to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" Sarah looked into Thomas's eyes and saw their entire future reflected there: children playing in the ranch yard, quiet evenings by the fire, years of shared joy and mutual support. "I do," she said, her voice strong and sure, "and I promise to love and support him, to be his partner in all things, and to build with him a home filled with love and laughter." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Thomas kissed her for the first time as her husband, Sarah felt a completeness she had never known was possible. This man had found her at her lowest point and seen not a burden or a charity case, but a woman worthy of love and respect. He had given her not just shelter, but a true home, not just survival, but a reason to thrive. As they walked back to the ranch house for the celebration feast Mrs. Rodriguez had prepared, Sarah caught sight of the oak tree where she had first tried to sleep rough all those months ago. For a moment, she could almost see her former self, desperate, afraid, convinced that her story was ending in failure and abandonment. If she could speak to that woman now, Sarah would tell her that sometimes, when it seems like everything is falling apart, it's actually falling into place. That sometimes you have to lose everything you think you want in order to find everything. you actually need. That sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is to end up with nowhere to go but up. But most of all, she would tell her that home isn't a place or a possession or a social position. Home is the person who looks at you at your absolute worst and says, "You belong with me." Home is the arms that catch you when you fall and the voice that says, "You're safe now." Home is love that asks for nothing more than the chance to keep loving. Sarah Brennan had found her home, and she was never going to let it go again. Years later, when Sarah would tell her children the story of how she and their father met, she would always end it the same way. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the words, "You need help," but the most important ones begin with your home now, and in the ranch house that had become a true home, filled with the laughter of children and the contentment of a love that had grown stronger with each passing year. Those words would ring as true as they had on that first cold night when a lonely rancher had seen a woman in desperate need and offered her not just shelter, but belonging. Sarah had learned that home wasn't something you inherited or purchased or earned through good behavior. Home was something you built, one act of love at a time, with someone who saw your worth even when you couldn't see it yourself. And in Thomas's arms, surrounded by the life they had created together, she knew she was finally, truly, completely home.